Hello, health seekers. Welcome to another episode of the KetoPro Podcast with myself, Richard Smith. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Dan Plews. Dan, welcome on board.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on, Richard.
No problem at all. Super excited. Long time overdue, Dan. Long time overdue.
Yeah, very long time overdue. Yeah, I was trying to wrap my brain as to when we first had contact, but it must be about maybe 2 years ago, I would guess.
Yeah, but possibly longer.
Yeah.
I think it's,
Wow.
you're a busy man. You're a busy man.
Yeah, always. But, I always say, I don't like using the word busy, but because I always feel it's self-inflicted, So,
Well,
so
100%.
can't complain.
Definitely. I think it's, if you're anything like me, I feel guilty if I'm not active and doing something. And I always feel this need to be pushing forward.
Yeah.
So it's,
Yes.
yeah,
As they say, it's very hard to get A-type personalities to do type B things and get type B personalities to do type A things. And I'm sure we're both the type A who aren't very good at type B type B things.
yeah, 100%, 100%. Dan, for the listeners who don't know an awful lot about you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So I'm based in New Zealand, Auckland, New Zealand. I have a few roles. One is I'm an academic, so I'm a senior researcher at AUT University here in Auckland, New Zealand. So I only specialize in postgrad, so PhDs and master's students. So I have a few PhD students who are doing various things. I guess my research is specialized in, it's quite diverse, mainly in heart rate variability with training adaptation for athletes with my PhD area. So I've done a lot in that. I've done a lot in diets, some stuff around the ketogenic diet and low carb diets and heat training and also a lot of things around specific macronutrient manipulation for training adaptation. So that's kind of my academic side. I'm also a sports scientist and a coach. So I was an applied practitioner for Rowing New Zealand. So I was the head physiology for there. I still work for Women's Kayak, the Women's Kayak Olympic program. So I'm still the physiologist in that program. And I've also was the head of performance for Emirates Team New Zealand as well. So the America's Cup. So I've done a wide variety of different types of sports. But my main background as an athlete was triathlon, was Ironman triathlon, and specifically I've done triathlon since I was 9 years old, so lifetime in that sport. I'm still currently the fastest ever age grouper in Kona, 8 hours 24. I was the first ever age group athlete to break 8 hours for an Ironman as well. But I stopped doing Ironman triathlon in 2022, and now I'm like fully into high rocks. So now I'm doing a lot of high rocks. I hold the APAC record for the 40 to 44 age group in the high rocks, and I'm going to the world champs in June for high rocks. So
Fantastic. What a career, and it's
lots to be said.
Yeah, for sure. Super impressive stuff. And I think it's, 8 hours 24 corner, incredible time. And I think for those who don't know much about Ironman, it's a grueler, isn't it? A 2.4 mile swim, 112 mile bike ride, followed by a marathon. And it's, I know lots of people who compete in Ironman events, and you see them all shapes and sizes, but it's, many of these are coming in, well above 10 hours, 10, 11, 12, because you can come in under 17 hours to
I think 17 hours is the cutoff. Yeah. So,
but there's a big difference.
I don't know what the median would be, like the median time would be, but I'm guessing it's around 11 hours would be probably where most people are kind of finishing.
Yeah. So, 9 hours that's pretty elite, isn't it?
Yeah, and then I went under 8 in California, so 7 hours 56 was my
Wow.
very, very best. But yeah, it's and I guess one of the things that we're talking to is one of the things that I was always been a big advocate of was lower carb diets for this. And I think my journey, I started, as I said, I've been doing triathlon since I was 9 years old, and I came right through the British system because I was born in the UK, so I went to Loughborough University. I had a scholarship at Loughborough University, and and that time it was very carbohydrate heavy, and I think that followed me all the way until I came to university, or until I came to New Zealand, where I was, working for High Performance Sport New Zealand, working in the Olympic rowing program. And then my supervisor for my PhD was Professor Paul Lawson, who you may know of. When we this is at the time when Tim Nuts was talking a lot about the ketogenic diet back in 2011, 2012, and we just tried it, experimented, and I would say that was kind of the turning point when I really started to get a lot better. I really improved. I think, I went from being a 410, 70.3 athlete to a 350, 70.3 athlete. My first Ironman was in 9 hours 23 in Kona and Taupo in 2013, and I'm progressively got faster and faster and faster. So,
wow.
So I'm sure we can talk a little bit about that.
Definitely, because it's anywhere within the athletic community, whether it's bodybuilding, strength, power, or endurance, carbs seem to predominate. And I don't believe it's optimal. I do believe that whether it's zero carb or whether it's a combination of carbs, as you say, right fuel, right time, I think that there's certainly key to being adapted to utilizing ketones and supplying most of your energy, at least from low carb, but it goes against everything that we're taught. And the second you mention this within the athletic community, people just switch off. Why do you think that is? Do you think it's a case that people just don't want to believe it, or do you think it's a case that maybe it's an addiction?
Yeah, I think it's twofold. I think one is that I think people when I think we all know that if you're a very high carb athlete, or you're very dependent on carbs, and you try not having carbs, you feel pretty crap, right? It's definitely a period of time where you have low energy, you don't perform very well for that, that kind of adaptation period, and that's where most people get stuck. They can't get past or through that adaptation period. So it's like, oh, I've tried that, I feel terrible, it doesn't work, I have no fuel. But and I always say that if I said to you tomorrow, any adaptation of a big change is going to not be pleasant. If I start giving you 800 grams of carbs tomorrow, you're so used to being on a low carb diet, you're going to feel terrible. And it's the same either way, really. And you can say, low carb athletes will say, I feel terrible with carbs. High carb athletes will say, I feel terrible without carbs. So I think there's that that's very specific. And I also think that particularly if athletes have been told that they have to, have a lot of carbs, they have to train the gut, I do think there is a bit of a sugar addiction, and the brain is just requiring this glucose fix continuously. And I think it's a bit of a double whammy.
Yeah, 100%. Look, it's sugar. It will elicit the same responses as drugs such as cocaine and heroin. And it can block the prefrontal cortex, inhibiting our ability to make sensible decisions. So from an evolutionary perspective, it was key to survival, but something that we wouldn't have consumed, on a daily basis and in high quantities. And I think, I believe that we are naturally born in the metabolic state of ketosis, and we've adapted over time, particularly the last 10,000 years, maybe into utilizing higher sugar diets. But it's, we've seen a decline.
If you look at babies will be in ketosis, newborns are in ketosis within a few hours,
Yeah.
and even one of the crazy things that I read, is that the mothers, when the mother's breastfeeding, they actually have MCT that's provided through the breast milk as well. So, we want to be in ketosis. It's actually quite natural, right? It's particularly for infants, which is, when you're, especially newborn breastfeeding children, is that we are supposed to have elements of ketosis in our well-being. And I don't think there's necessarily you have to be in ketosis all the time, but I do believe that some kind of cyclical ketosis is good. And I think for athletes, you don't necessarily have to be on particularly an endurance athlete who's doing who's doing long endurance rides. you're really ramping up beta oxidation. You have a lot of free circulating triglycerides, and that means that you will have natural exercise-induced ketosis, and you'll naturally cycle in and out of ketosis. But if you never give yourself the ability to burn fats, or you're just fueling yourself with 30 grams or more, 60 grams of carbs every single hour, you never give yourself the opportunity to be in that state. And that's one of the reasons that, athletes will go out and they'll quote unquote, they'll bonk when they don't have carbohydrates. And the reason is because they have zero ability to produce any ketones and actually use fat as a fuel. And because there's two different things, right? There's ketones as a metabolic fuel, but there's also just having a very efficient beta oxidation. I don't think if you're doing an Ironman, to be in ketosis and using ketone as a fuel, I don't think is optimal, but you can train within the ketogenic state or train in a lower carb state to build your beta oxidation, so you have that ability to use fat as a fuel when you're exercising.
Yeah, I think it's a minefield, and I think you're right. It's when we come into this world, we come into it as in a ketogenic state, and then in fact, mother's breast milk is the only thing in nature, that we, other than milk in general, that contains all three macronutrients. Besides this animal proteins, there's protein and fat, and then we've got the sugars, and they're separate things. And due to the activation and elicitation of the Randall cycle, we very rarely consume all three in nature, apart from mother's breast milk. But we are the only animals, on the planet that still drink milk past the age of infancy, and from a different animal. So it's but I'm people think that I am anti-carb because of what I do, but it's I'm not anti-carb. I try to teach nutrition, real nutrition, and for me, the gravitation has seen me over time reduce carb. But I've tried experimenting with all sorts of carb use. I'm a sugar addict. I've come from a high sugar background, so I've tried front loading, back feeding, targeted refeeds. And coming back to a point you just made, it's trying to put carb into someone who is low carb just doesn't work. It seems to elicit a thromboxane and leukotriene response where I struggle to breathe if I eat carbs, and train. So it doesn't work for me. But I'm certainly not against, the use of carb. And within this space, it seems to be black or white, isn't it? It's either one or the other, and I don't believe it needs to be that either. I do believe that there can be the middle ground.
Yeah, well, when I was being interviewed the other day, and I think what's becoming increasingly apparent now is that athletes have choices. If you look at the research, if you really look at the research, when athletes are given the correct amount of time for adaptation, which is 6 weeks or more, that's the amount of time we need. 3 weeks is not enough. If you actually look, 3 weeks is the point where people will be feeling the worst. But this is like, the Louise Burke studies and all those like race walker studies. That's what the point when they test. 3 weeks test, not enough time. Provided the time is long enough, the adaptation time is long enough, which is 6 weeks, there seems to be no difference whether you're on a high carb diet or a low carb diet to performance over a variety of distances. So you can look at 800 meter runs, you can look at time to exhaustion. There doesn't seem to be any difference. So the idea that if you're an endurance athlete, you must be on a high carb diet for optimal performance is becoming debunked, and it's not really true. You have a choice. So therefore, the choice should be dependent on your metabolic predisposition. So how well you can metabolize carbohydrates, what you're basically your resting blood glucose, and how that's looking, and if you're someone who is almost pre-diabetic, or you have a very high resting blood glucose in the morning fasted, you're probably not someone who's going to be wanting to go on a high carb diet. So it has to be very individualized. And I think over the years, I think I've changed a little bit to always want to, for athletes at least, prioritize protein first, and then whether you put the carbs or the fat in is very dependent on what your fat metabolism is. So if you're someone with a very, very low fat metabolism, you're trying to do an Ironman, you're probably going to need to get that up. and also how well you metabolize glucose and what that looks like. And then, you know, whether you have more carbs or more fats, it depends on that. And also your age. I think as we get older, you can, if you're a triathlete in your 20s, you can probably have your proteins and, you know, you're pouring a little bit more of the carbs. But as you get older, you got to shift, and you can't just keep doing the same things all the way through your life.
Yeah, 100%. It's interesting. I mean, you mentioned some of the studies by Louise Burke, and as you say, they were done on athletes 3 weeks in with lack of electrolyte supplementation, which is crucial especially in the early stages, and lack of quality aminos. You know, so it's anyone who gravitates into a low carb ketogenic way of living is the insulin is going to drop, and insulin pulls sodium from 4 points in the nephrons in the kidneys back into the blood. So it's responsible for reabsorption. And when insulin drops, it releases the sodium, which leads to what we know as keto flu. So, you know, correct supplementation of a quality electrolyte in the early stages, at least, I would argue, indefinitely with most people, but certainly
particularly in the early stages. So we had a PhD, you know Cliff Harvey?
No, not familiar.
Harvey? So Cliff Harvey was a PhD student at AUT University. He's finished now. He's a great person in this space, and he basically he did his PhD in this area, and he found that, you know, that the keto flu was it was dependent on two things, and one was the sodium, but two was just the general energy availability. So you just drop your energy availability and you feel crap. But it's worse at the start, right? And then it seems to equilibrium or equalize as they progress.
Yeah, but I mean, it's, you know, it's certainly a crucial piece, isn't it? You know, that and it's interesting that Professor Noakes has released a study recently, isn't it, in regards to the amount of glucose per hour required to prevent hypoglycemia, and it's much lower than we're led to believe.
10 grams an hour. Yeah, so I mean,
super low.
Yeah, it's super low when you're considering that some people are pushing up to 180 grams now,
wow,
which is crazy. Like, and you know, and if you look at oxidation rates, there's where that's going, who knows? Because it's not being oxidized. It's certainly not being used. And my argument has always been with those high carbohydrate intake is that if you look at all the research behind carbohydrate feeding during endurance exercise, there's this idea that it's stopping glycogen depletion, right? It's not doing that. If you look at the rate of glycogen depletion is almost is the same no matter how much carbohydrate you take in. The main difference is coming in blood glucose maintenance. So what Tim Noakes and Prins and Kutnik showed was that if you start in a glycogen depleted state and you take enough carbohydrate to purely maintain blood glucose, performance is maintained. So and it was a big argument whether, you know, there's a lot of debate around that paper, but I think it is becoming clear is that, you know, it's clear that that's what carbohydrates are doing during exercise, is the maintenance of blood glucose. So you shouldn't theoretically have to take more than that. And if you look at the dosing response and performance, there's a great paper by Smith et al. Where it went from basically 30 to 120 grams and looked at performance. And basically from about 30 to 75 grams, it seemed to make a difference. More than 70, it got worse. Less than 30, it got worse. So there's this, you know, there's a big range, really. The outcome of that paper was 75 grams seemed to be the best. But, you know, if you actually look at the chart, it's very flat line from 30 to 75 grams. So.
Interesting. And I think it is very much an individual thing as well, because as you say, I think it depends on what you're, you know, naturally predispositioned to be processing. You know, we know
but also what you find is that if you look at the substrate utilization of athletes when they're taking in carbohydrates, it's basically you have your fat metabolism, you have your carbohydrate metabolism. And the more carbs you take in, the more you ramp up your carbohydrate metabolism, the more you drive down your fat metabolism. The less you take in, the more you keep up your fat metabolism, carbohydrate metabolism stays the same. So it's very direct. So it's very simple that your body's very smart. Taking more carbohydrates, you'll burn them. Taking less, you'll burn more fat. it's just, but if you don't have the ability to burn a lot of fat and you never give yourself the machinery to do it, then you're in a bit of a pickle, right? You have to depend on the carbohydrates. But provided your fat metabolism is very strong, you can do a lot. And so when I raced in Kona in 2018, when I went 824, for example, my fat mass was 1.4 grams per minute with carbohydrates. So that wasn't me in a ketogenic state. You know, it's just normal, just a normal, not really pushing myself to have as high a fat metabolism as I possibly could. So if I went in glycogen depleted, ketogenic, I probably would have been a little bit higher, but it was 1.4 grams per minute. And on the bike, I took 50 grams of carbs per hour, which is modest, very modest. And then on the run, I had one gel over the whole marathon. So one gel, 30 grams of carbs over 3 hours, 2 hours 50. But, you know, people would say that's impossible. And I did the same thing when I broke the record in California, when I went under 8 hours. And I did a Instagram post that said, you know, I took one gel. And there was just uproar about it. You know, I was being accused of doing it as a marketing stunt. You know, it's like, it's, they don't want to, many athletes, they just don't want to believe it and they don't want to hear it because they're so dependent and enjoy taking the carbohydrates, you know. Athletes are very good at doing things. They're not very good at not doing things. So it's always why when I tell an athlete, when I want an athlete to lose weight, I'll tell them to add in more protein rather than take things away, because it's just the athlete mindset. Do this exercise, do this mobility, do this. Take something away really hard. So
yeah, 100%. And you know, just circling back to the point you made earlier, I think protein is the key to everything, and I think it's that's the main factor that most athletes seem to overlook in regards to the compound that's going to heal and repair the body. You know, if we look at what protein synthesis is, I mean, it's you know, essentially breaking down the amino acids or the proteins that we consume and reconstituting them into human proteins. And yet, most endurance athletes will prioritize carb, and I think you're right. I think that the source of carb makes a difference as well. It's you know, I find that many athletes will consume. They'll do their carb load, which to me is counterintuitive for a start, because for every 1 gram of glyco you consume, and your body's going to store 3 grams of water. So now you're running the marathon and you're heavier, which seems counterintuitive.
If you look at the even if you look at the carbo loading research, it's quite interesting, right? Because it's not as simple as what people may believe. Because what happens is, it may make a difference over, like, counterintuitively over actual shorter events, like 30 minutes, because what happens is the more carbs you have on board at the start, you burn more carbs at the start. So you really go into the high octane, just burning carbs as much as you can, no fat oxidation. But if you have someone over the course of an Ironman, the person who has carbo loaded, they burn carbs at such a fast rate. By an hour and a half, they're in exactly the same position as the person who hasn't carbo loaded. So actually, for an Ironman, it doesn't make any difference, because by an hour and a half, you're in the exact same state. So people think I'm carbo loading for an Ironman. You're not. You're just making yourself burn more carbs at the start, and I don't think that's a good thing. You know, you just think of what's happening with the dirty metabolism of more carbohydrates as well.
Yeah.
For want of a better word. So it's totally misunderstood. And if anyone actually went into the research and really looked at it, they'd see that it's not, after an hour and a half, over an 8, 9, 10, 11-hour event, making no difference really. It's just making you feel sluggish.
Yeah. Which, I mean, is counterintuitive, isn't it? So, I mean, that's just reinforcing that activation of the Randall cycle, in which, you know, the substrate that we're prioritizing is going to be utilized first. But it's What's most of our training is zone 2. You know, we're teaching the body to burn fat for fuel, and then we're putting lots of carb in, which to me just seems counterintuitive anyway, you know. But it's interesting that you mentioned that athletes in their early 20s can almost, and we see it across the board in professional sports, where they'll go out on, you know, on a night out drinking, turn up and perform at a high level, and deliver the goods.
Used to be me. Yeah, I mean, I did that. Like when I was at Loughborough University, we'd go out on some big nights out, and then we'd be in the pool at 5:30 the next morning, I just remember that you could just smell the alcohol and at the end of the pool when people are coming in and touching the wall, But you could do it, and now I don't drink at all. I drink zero, So it's just because I don't feel your body changes, right? So to think that you shouldn't adapt to your lifestyle and the way you eat as you get older is a bit crazy, right? People adapt the way they move, they adapt to many things, but and diet should definitely be one of them.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it comes from evolution and our species' ability to survive, because we can seem to get away with a lot of things in early life, and then as we turn 20, I think this is why athletes seem to hit the upper limit and start a downward curve in athletic performance. But I do believe that excessive amounts of carbohydrate is damaging in regards to glycation, activation of the NOx pathway, NFKB, all of these things. And we know these things happen whether we want them to or not. And it just makes more sense that a lower carbohydrate approach is going to cause far less damage in regards to these. And you mentioned Lionel Sanders, which you've done an incredible video on, which we'll pop a link in below to take a look at. But it just goes to show that you can't out-train a bad diet. I think it's but what I find is if there's another way to perform at an equal level on far less carbohydrate, why wouldn't we do that?
Yeah, because it's hard. Because it's a little bit harder. And honestly, we're against it's, I think a lot of this is driven by sports industry and the nutrition industry, right? Because if you're a carbohydrate company and you've got gels, you've got carbohydrate drinks, if you're saying to the athlete, oh, you don't really need this so much, only when you're racing. I'm an athlete, so racing 2 times a year, 3 times a year. How much product are you going to sell?
Exactly.
Zero. Yeah. Almost none. So if you're not promoting the need to train the gut, the need for recovery, you're not going to sell much product. And I think that's a big part of it, as much as I hate to say it. And and I think even industry drives a lot of bad advice. I'm not saying that some athletes, there's definitely anecdotal evidence of some athletes who really thrive on very high carbohydrate consumption, right? So Tadej Pogačar, right? He's the Tour de France winner. There's talk that he consumes a lot of carbohydrates during the Tour de France, right? But we can't be comparing ourselves. Like the average amateur athlete who's probably listening to this cannot be comparing themselves to that 99.99999% person who is a total outlier. And this is where science and academic papers, they need to drive the guidelines, right? So with carbohydrate fueling, we haven't seen that 120 grams is better. In fact, we've seen the opposite. We've seen that it drives down endogenous stores. So you use more of your endogenous stores as soon as you get to high carbohydrate rates, 120 grams an hour. So Andrew King's showed this in some great papers. So you can look those up. But what we seem to be in the position of is that rather than science guiding guidelines, we have anecdote and outliers driving guidelines. So we have these outliers driving guidelines for the masses, and that shouldn't be that way around. We need the science driving the guidelines for the masses. And then, yes, there might be some outliers who thrive on a higher or even a lower amount, but we don't start with the outlier as the guidelines and then go from there.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's an important point. It's whenever I've spoken to people, it's always a case of, regardless of whatever athlete that you mention, I've mentioned you in conversations, I've mentioned Mikey, the Ironman athlete, which we can get into, lots of my other athletes, but there's always a case of, so-and-so is faster. Well, there's always going to be someone faster. But as you say, someone at the top end who is utilizing something, they are, the top 0.11, percent, and it's like the average athlete isn't going to ever need the requirement for this. But what damage comes along with this high volume of carbohydrate intake?
And also, it's all very well comparing yourself to someone, this person's faster, but really we should be comparing ourselves to people who are like us. You know, like
100%.
they're the better comparisons. You know, it's like, you know, you should be comparing yourself to another age grouper who is doing very similar things, who's just not gone to the Olympics, not won an Olympic gold medal. It's just like a normal age grouper who has a day job, has a family. These are the people who you should be comparing yourself to, not the outliers.
Yeah, it 100%. There's we mentioned Mikey, who you met at Kona, achieved just over 9 hours. I think if it wasn't for the humidity, he would have gone less. There's another athlete I work with, Sandy Alexander Whisker. He's an age grouper, I think 55. He achieved a 10-hour Ironman and a sub 5, which is incredible for. So this is someone who was a high carb athlete also, and experimented, gravitated, and being a few years older, he's at least as good as he was when he was on carb, and if not better. I mean, some of the it's difficult to compare race to race because every race is different, every course is different. But we know he's at least as good, if not better. And then another one of the guys that I did a podcast with recently, Ifan, world record holder in his age category. He's low carb, so not keto or carnivore. But these people are out there. These are your average, well, they're way better than average. But I mean, these are people that people that you pass in the street, and they're achieving incredible things.
Yeah, and Richard, we've seen the same sort of thing. So, I mean, when I finished Kona in 2018, I went on a few podcasts, and I talked a lot about my diet, and we had a lot of questions around. I had a lot of questions about how I did things, how I did it around training, and. And from that we launched a course called LDT 101, which is it's a course that's all around low carbohydrate diets, specifically for Ironman triathlon or any kind of ultra distance triathlon, really. We've had, it's our most popular course. Thousands of people have come through that course, and I would say that we have changed the lives of many athletes who have done it, for the better, and performance, just the way they feel and their performance. So it's definitely something that is real, and I've seen it and I've heard it. We've got thousands and thousands of testimonials of people who have been through the course, and it's made the biggest of difference. I think Mikey did the course. He's one of them who followed that protocol. So what we do is with that is slightly different, is that we kind of do like a ketogenic phase, and then we kind of bring them back up to what we call the sweet spot, which is anywhere between 100 and 200 grams of carbs per day, depending on who you are and how you're cycling. So we don't have anything specific, but we call it the sweet spot. So typically I was around 120 to 130 grams a day. That means I would be in ketosis sometimes after my morning rides and stuff like that. So we've had such great success with it, and a very small, we had 40 to 50 grams of carbs before racing for the 3 days before. So just small nuances, because the devil's in the detail with it. Because what we talked about before, one of the things that I mentioned is that I'm not convinced ketogenics is being in ketosis is optimal for an Ironman, because what we talked about with the Prince study, the 10 grams per hour and maintenance of hyperglycemia, to be in a ketogenic state, you have to have liver glycogen depleted. Right, liver glycogen needs to be very low to be producing ketones and beta-hydroxybutyrate, and the liver is so important for the maintenance of blood glucose. So I think that's where I think having a topped up liver glycogen and also then having a high fat metabolism is the optimal way to maintain blood glucose, because you've got the titration from the liver, and you've got the low drawdown because your fat metabolism is so high, and that's why we see so much success.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think for most people, that's probably the case. Do you know what I would argue? And it would be interesting, and I'm trying to get a study for this. So I've been speaking to Professor Noakes, because I've been zero carb for a very long time, and we mentioned that fat adaptation takes around 6 weeks. But what I've found is through my journey, and my journey was through necessity, because carbs were incredibly problematic for me. So the gravitation towards low carb was extremely long. So you're talking 6 to 12 months. And during that time, between the 6 to 12 months, I managed to increase the monocarboxylate transporters and utilization of enzymes like BDH, ACAT, and SCOT. And I think that's another level So I genuinely believe, and I'd love to see a study on this, and I don't believe it's ever been done, but on complete zero carb athletes, because I believe that their ability to create glucose via gluconeogenesis and the upregulation is enough
Yeah.
to overcome. But I know 10 grams is as we know in a 6-week adapted athlete, but I'd love to see a study on fully adapted zero
Yeah,
carb athletes.
yeah, it's a great question because theoretically, if you can ramp up your internal carbohydrate sources from other areas, so you actually can almost restore your liver glycogen from gluconeogenesis, and even the breaking down of a triglyceride molecule, and the glycerol molecule can feed into the carbohydrate sources, right? Just from having a high fat metabolism. And I've always said that I do think that it is the gift that keeps on giving, and it seems that you get better and better and better. And I had another pro athlete, a guy called Jan van Berkel, who was, you probably don't know about this, but it'll blow your mind. He won Ironman New Zealand in the pro 4 times, and he was low carb keto, low carb, and I called him the keto cop. That's his nickname. But 237, 230, and he would just rip everyone in the marathon. Last time you did not want to be near him with 10K to go in a marathon because he would not slow down. 237 marathon in an Ironman, one of the best runners there was in the end in the field. I wrote a blog on his progression since I started with him, and he went on the low carb journey, and we felt like it was the gift that kept on giving, and he just got better and better and better. So I do think that there could be something.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff, and in fact, I've got some. Let me see if I can find. I've got 2 pics here from Mikey. Mikey ran. So Mikey incorporated, the protocol in regards to 40 to 50 grams an hour in Ironman Corner, which is ridiculously low compared to most.
Yeah.
All of his training is done on zero carb. He came to see me as a vegan, started to suffer with health problems, came to one of my talks, gravitated into low carb. Now he's carnivore predominantly, it's
Okay.
so zero carb. So what we decided to do is let me share the screen. He decided to run the Newport Marathon the weekend just gone on zero carb. And am I sharing the screen there?
Yeah.
Brilliant. So it's as you can see, his position in his age category, bit by bit, the further he was going, the better his position, which was incredible. And what's interesting is, where are we? Let me pull this one up. So this was, can you see that one?
Yeah.
Am I on? Yeah. Okay. So it's, we've got Mikey's progression over the course of the marathon, and you can see like the average athlete starts to fall apart the longer that they're going along the marathon. And in fact, Mikey was improving. So he came in at 237, but it's completely zero carb, and it was at high intensity for him also. But he just kept on giving and giving, So but he's been over 2 years in the making in regards to being low carb. Where's the end of this? I can't believe there. Stop sharing. So it's taken a long time. We progressed over a prolonged period of time in being zero carb. But the fact is, most people don't want to be zero carb. Most people.
And I think I think there's more to it than just being zero carb. I do feel that it's quite hard. I mean, the adherence of being zero carb is quite tricky.
For sure.
And I think even ketogenic is quite tricky. It's hard. But you go, the difference between being 50 grams, 20 to 50 grams a day versus 100 to 150 grams a day, it's night and day with how hard that is. It's so much easier. I've been like 150 grams all the time, and it's so easy to do. It's just the way I naturally live now. But let's go back to that chart that you showed. I did a very similar thing to when in Kona in 2018, I did a similar figure of my runs compared to all the pros because I could get the splits. And by I think it was the last 2 miles, I was running faster than every single pro, apart from the one who won. And I had the 5th fastest run in the entire race, including the professionals.
Wow.
My last 2 miles was like the fastest out of everyone, apart from the Patrick Langer who won the race. So it goes to show, I always felt that in that race, I always felt my metabolism was always strong, but my muscles were giving out a lot of the time. My quads were just burning, but in that race they didn't. And so finally I pulled together a great marathon.
Yeah, so while everyone else is falling apart, you seem to be improving, which is absolutely bonkers.
Even when I won in California, my last 10K was my fastest 10K in a marathon, which is unheard of.
Wow.
So
yeah.
I kind of just held on to it for 30, and then I ran the last 10K hard, and it was my fastest. So
super impressive. And it seems, there's no greater test really than an Ironman, is it? And I potentially the 70.3 is, I would argue is possibly harder in regards to intensity, because you're pushing that little bit harder for that period of time. And I think maybe Ironman is more geared up for fat burning, but it's
of course it is. Yeah, the thing is that I think, and this is one of the problems I even have with some of the studies that do, there's no improvement in performance over 10K when you're keto adapted or whatever that might be. But it's like, well, how important is having a high fat metabolism for running a 10K? It's not important at all. It's a bit like me making you do a bench press and say, hey, lo and behold, your Ironman didn't get any better. It's like, yeah, of course. It doesn't. It's not a determinant of success in that event. So the longer you go, the more important it becomes, of course. So, and we even see that within some of the the exogenous ketone research. It's almost detrimental from 30 to 60 minutes of exercise. And it seems to be over 4 hours where we seem to start seeing a small improvement or a small benefit.
Yeah, it's crazy. I couldn't, I'm new to running, so as my career was bodybuilding, and I started to work with endurance athletes, amateur triathletes. So they laid down the gauntlet, if you like, and if ketogenic low carb lifestyles are so good, come and show us. So I did. I started running, and I could not run 1.5K for the first two times. The first two times, it was embarrassing because I ran around a local pond that is a popular place for people to go where I live, and I had KetoPro on my back, with my hoodie, and 1.5K in, and I had to walk back to the car with my head to the floor. Super embarrassing. Incredibly embarrassing. So needless to say, the next time around, I didn't wear my hoodie, but and these times are going to sound awful to an athlete such as yourself, but within a short space of time, I managed to achieve a 17.5-minute 5K. It's for someone who's a non-runner, and my first 5K was 42 minutes. So when I did run a 5K,
more like a 10K time.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah. And now my 10K is considerably quicker at like 37 minutes. But it's, I'm completely zero carb constantly, so as you know, I'm carnivore. It's been a long time since I've consumed any form of carb, but I've done runs from 5K up to, I've never gone beyond half a marathon because I don't like running. So it's like, I find, but what I have done is when I was training with the athletes for Ironman, I did ride the Ironman Wales course, which is one of the toughest ones in the world.
Yeah, my brother did that course. Yeah.
Super brutal. Now I was new to cycling. So, I'd been riding 30, 40 miles in what I would call a Tuesday coffee ride, where we just go out for a couple of miles, and it was incredibly slow and relaxed and chatty. And then suddenly we did an 80-mile, which I did on one bottle of water, by the way, 80 miles. And then a few weeks after, we did the Ironman loop. The first time that I did it, I went and I did 90 miles, and one of the guys who was training, he did his 6 hours because we were brutal course, so he's quite slow as well. And he was done, so I went back with him, and I had loads of abuse because it's like, see, you bonked your keto and you couldn't make the 112. And it wasn't the case. It was brutal because I'd never ridden that long before, and people forget how difficult it is to build up to doing a 100-mile bike ride. So I finished with him at 90, but I never lived it down. So I went back the week later with them, and we rode again, and I did the 112, and I had the highest average moving speed and the quickest time up one of the steepest parts of the Ironman course out of everybody within the group. And I'm incredibly new to cycling. My FTP, I think, is 292, which isn't brilliant, but for someone who's not a cyclist either.
How much do you weigh?
Now I'm 69, so I'm super light.
That's a good FTP then. 69 at 290 watts. I mean, that's better than a lot of age group triathletes.
Whether I could do that now, I've barely ridden for the last few months, but that's what I got to when I was really pushing for, for the running and the cycling. But yeah, I did lots of lots of rides with Mikey, and the guy's an animal, so trying to keep up with him was brutal. But all of these were done on, complete zero carb. So I know that it can be done. And I think that, as you say, it's the gift that keeps on giving. But the reality is most people don't want to commit to being that adapted. So I think, as you say, the right fuel, right time approach with the utilization of, there is a gray area. It doesn't have to be black or white. You can be, incredibly fat adapted, and utilize both.
There was one of my friends, a guy called Marco Altini. So me and Marco are writing a book together on heart rate variability at the moment. But Marco is the owner of the app HRV for Training. So it's the best app there is out there for analyzing your heart rate variability if anyone's interested in doing that space. But Marco, he's a marathon runner. And he just published a blog where he completely changed his eating to the right fuel, right time approach, and he documented it because he's a PhD data scientist, and he documented it brilliantly. And it is easily the best and most robust example of right fuel, right time training I've ever seen, and it's really well done. And he thrived amazingly, and he shows his macronutrient distribution between hard days and easy days, and it's great. So anyone who's interested in how to do the right fuel, right time approach, I would definitely read that. And to me, I think that is the ultimate. It's the ultimate diet that I think will work for most people. Because it's quite. It's just got. It's just very balanced, and where you're shifting, and I think people need to get. There's a bit of a difference between within the literature. There's fuel for the work required versus right fuel, right time, and they are distinctly different. So fuel for the work required that has been published a lot is basically you're increasing and decreasing your carbohydrate intake based on based on your training load. So the more training you do, the more you eat carbohydrates. The less training you do, the less you eat carbohydrates. But for most of the nutritionists out there, it's like you're talking about going from 800 grams to 400 grams. It's like, what do you want? A lot of carbohydrate or an extreme amount of carbohydrates? It's like that's kind of the way the fuel for the work required. Whereas right fuel, right time is where you're restricting carbohydrates for specific reasons. So you might restrict carbohydrates to increase your fat metabolism during a level 2 ride. You might restrict your carbohydrates during a clamped tempo ride to increase your AMPK activation to enhance your mitochondria. You might increase your carbohydrate during a glycolytic session to improve your glycolytic flux and improve your glycolytic activity. So it's very different. So you're actually specifically changing your macronutrients in accordance to the type of training you're doing, the training type, rather than just increasing or decreasing just dependent on the load. And I think the way Marco did it was very much right fuel, right time. He definitely wasn't fuel for the work required because he lost 10 kilos during the process. Wow. So you can't say he obviously was a bit in a negative energy balance, but his fat metabolism improved massively. His times got faster. His economy got better. It's very good. So anyone should definitely watch that. I talk about it in that Lionel Sanders blog. I talk about the way Marco did it. So yeah, people should check it out.
Yeah, fantastic stuff. And obviously, Dan, you offer coaching within Enduro IQ. Where can people find that if they want to approach you for coaching?
Yeah, so I mean, Enduro IQ, we've been around since 2017, and our slogan's always been performance, health, and enjoyment. In that I've always been a big proponent that athletes do training because they want to be healthier, and I think that we can get a little bit mixed up with what's optimal for health and what's optimal for performance, and we try and take this more holistic approach. So we have different offerings. We have the courses that I talked about. So anyone who's interested in learning about a lower carb approach for specifically ultra distance racing, we have LDT 101. We've also got courses on heat training, just general training science, and athlete monitoring, and a strength one as well. So we have those different courses available. And then we have a one-on-one coaches. So we've got 7 amazing coaches who take athletes one-on-one for the more personalized touch. And then we have our Endure IQ training squad, which is more of a community-based training squad, which is obviously a more affordable rate than the one-on-one stuff. So weekly webinars and things like that. So
yeah, super exciting stuff. So there's something there for everyone, essentially.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. So, and anyone's in Hyrox, we have another company called Endurox, which is Hyrox training.
Brilliant. Which I haven't told you this yet. High rocks is something that I'm going to gravitate into, or at least try to. I'm not a runner. I'm not a cyclist. I'm never going to be, an elite Ironman. I don't have the time, the dedication, and I've started very, very late in life. But coming from the bodybuilding background, where I managed to achieve some decent levels of results, I think that gravitating towards high rocks could be a perfect blend, because I'm not too shabby at running. And if I've just started back, so I'm incredibly small currently, but I've just started back with some strength work. So watch this space, because high rocks is something that I want to gravitate into. So we'll see how that goes.
It's great. I have to say I really enjoy it for sure, and it's been nice getting a bit. I mean, it's amazing how weak you can be as an Ironman triathlete. I couldn't when I finished Ironman. I mean, I'm still not that strong, but I couldn't even bench press 60 kilos. So that's how weak I was. But I've got. I went. So it was an interesting journey, because I finished doing Ironman. And I really wanted to pack on muscle and get bigger. So I was at 74 kilos, and I went and did a real bodybuilding work, so very specific, muscle groups, 6 sessions a day, long eccentric phases. So I was really studying that area, and I was like 3,500 calories a day, 200 to 300 grams of protein a day. I was really eating a lot, and I went quite quickly from 74 to 89 kilos.
Wow.
Very quick. And I wouldn't say I was massively, I wasn't like really, I didn't have that much adipose tissue. But I have to say I didn't really enjoy it. I think it's like, you said you didn't really enjoy running. I didn't really enjoy that very much. I felt sluggish. I felt heavy. I felt like I was always full up, always overeating, which I didn't really enjoy. And then I got into the high rocks. So now I'm back to 81, 80 to 80. It depends. It can be anywhere 79 to 82, depending on the day. But I'm still a lot heavier than I was. But I think that process, it really helped with my high rocks, because I went up and then I went back down. So I almost bulked for a high rocks, and then got a bit stronger, got a bit more mass, which is helpful for the pushing of the sleds and pulling of the sleds. And then I went back down to, and now I'm back to running fast, and I've got a reasonable amount of strength. But it's surprising, because I have a lot of my friends who are like strength and conditioners, for example, who work in that space, and put them in a high rocks, and they're not as strong as they think they are, because of the overall fatiguing aspect. So even things like the farmers carry, where you're carrying 32 kilos in each hand for the pro weight, that they're putting it down, whereas I wouldn't be putting it down, even though they're a lot stronger than me. So it's an interesting that hybrid mixture is pretty cool.
Yeah, and it seems awesome. I'm looking forward. I've recently started training with some ski erg and some rows and some wall balls, which are absolutely brutal. But I've literally only had a few sessions. Things are improving quickly, and I think if I can retain some of the running speed. So I train with Mikey. Track sessions every Wednesday. I run like once a week. So to achieve like a 17-minute 5K and It's running once. I literally run like 6 miles probably a week, which is ridiculously low compared to the 60 to 80 miles that a runner would do. But it's I'm hoping I can retain some of that and gravitate into high rocks. Who knows? Maybe I'll join you in a comp at one time in the future.
Yeah.
But that'll be awesome. But currently, I mean,
we could do a doubles, KetoPro doubles.
Definitely. There we are. I'll hold you to that. But your times are incredible, aren't they? I mean, it's the first one I saw you do was sub hour, and that was on the amateur weeks.
Actually, my very first one was 1 hour, 1 minute 32, and then I went sub hour in Auckland. It was 58. I think it was 58.50, which was a but they were in the open division. But the one in Auckland was a very slow course, so it was outside, it had a bit of a ramp, it was a baking hot day, so the times were quite slow. But then I went over to Brisbane, I did the pro weight, and I went faster. I went 1 hour, 1 minute, but I went faster than I did for my first one in Brisbane in the open. So I'm hoping that in Chicago I just need to do a little bit of tweaking. I can definitely get under the hour for the pro, so that'll be my aim. So
impressive stuff. And when is that?
14th of June.
Awesome. So not too long. I'll keep an eye out for that.
I mean, full training is in full swing. So one of the main things that was, years and years of Ironman is mobility. Mobility was a big issue for me. So I've been really working on like mobility, and it's been really, really helping. And it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, I'm 42 now, and even now you would think my body is like fixed, but it's so changeable still. It's incredible. Like I've packed on so much muscle. I'm so much, I would say my body shape and composition has totally changed. My mobility is way better than it's ever been. And it's, it's just, the human body is an incredible thing to, when you make the changes that you need to.
Yeah. Super impressive stuff. I mean, those times, ridiculously impressive. And I think you're ranked quite highly in the world currently in age. Is that right?
Yeah. I think my time was the 7th fastest in the world ever in the open.
Wow.
Yeah.
Impressive stuff.
I mean, I think I'd like to think I stand a bit of a chance of doing something good in Chicago, but we'll see. I actually think I'm better at the pro weight than I am at the open weight. I think I have a better balance, because you can the open weight lends itself. If you're a very fast runner, you can always get away with it. But when you do the pro weight, there's a bit of more of element of strength involved in size, and I think that helps. I mean, when I was doing Ironman, I always felt like I was forcing myself to be lighter than I wanted to be, and now I'm kind of more probably where my body actually appreciates it to be, really, because at 74 I was really forcing myself light as possible, always being a bit hungry, always being a bit restrictive, and now I don't have to be that way, which is quite nice.
Yeah, impressive stuff. Dan, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting. I think we could talk for hours. So look, if you're up for it, I'd love to get you back on to talk about other topics moving forward. In the meantime, you've got you're on Instagram, you're on YouTube. Where can people find you if they want to follow you?
Yeah, I think Instagram's the place I'm most active. I haven't done much on YouTube, but I have started doing a little bit more. So I'm doing a little bit in that space. So the Endure IQ, which is not under my name, it's under the Endure IQ account. So if you look for Endure IQ, you'll find that. But yeah, there will be the two main things. I also do a little bit on X, but probably not as much as I would on Instagram, which is the Plews.
Instagram is the place to be. Awesome stuff. Dan, been an absolute pleasure, my man. Thanks again.
Pleasure.
Yeah. Take care, and I will speak to you soon.
Yeah. Thanks, man.